Welcome back to From the Belly. I'm Doug Wheeler, and as I say every episode, and I think we're now in this iteration of From the Belly, we're in our, I think we've got 22 podcasts that are available. You folks know where to find those. It's Christmas time, so maybe pass them on to your friends. I don't know if you can put it in a package in a bow and put a bow on it, but we've done some really, really good interviews. We being myself, and I couldn't do it without the guests that I have today. I've got Dr. Randal Rauser. And Randal, welcome from Canada.
Thanks, Doug. Good to be with you.
Randal and I, we had to kind of wrestle this down to our schedules, but we got it. So I'm really grateful for the time. We have about an hour, and we know that we'll do a little bit of editing. So I want to get just right into the meat of it. But I want to first say that this is like the first for me in this new season of Why Not Church, or maybe Why Church. And we're going to kind of in an indirect way, and maybe some direct ways even, Randal and I will be discussing that, but not really on the nose, if you will. But it's the first time that I haven't been wearing my helicopter headset with the awkward mic and all. And I actually feel freer as a human being. So I think I might set that aside and never do it again. I couldn't get the crazy thing hooked up today in time to jump on with Randal. I didn't want to be late. So I'm like, let's roll. So again, Randal, thank you. I'm going to speak about your bio. If I get anything wrong and you feel the need to correct it, please do so. Dr. Rauser is a systematic and analytic theologian of evangelical persuasion. He is driven by apologetic concerns and, above all, the tireless pursuit of truth. This is you in your own words, and I think I got it from your website. I'm a broadly evangelical Christian, says seminary professor, but you used to be that. Writer, husband, dad, Canadian animal lover, an all-around nice guy, and then you do have in parentheses, or so people tell me to my face anyway, but behind my back, I'm not so sure. And I would say that maybe it doesn't even have to be behind your back, because I've been watching some of the stuff that's pretty current of some conversations you've been having. And there's some folks that don't like the things that you're saying, the things that you're bringing up. And you and I were talking beforehand that that's an indication that you're doing something right, of making, as one said, John, forgetting John's name, you make good trouble. You're making good trouble. I want to say a little bit about where you come from, because I think that's really important for people to know where you've gotten to. I was born into a Christian home. This is your writing. This provides my starting point for thinking about the divine. Some folks who are born into a Christian home find that experience has driven them away from the Christian description of the divine. But in my case, my experience being reared in a Christian home has provided good reasons to continue to understand the divine in accord with Christian truth descriptions. Consequently, I retain the belief with which I was raised. Christianity provides the most accurate set of beliefs and practices for understanding and relating to the divine, culminating in the claim that the divine was and is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. You also refer to yourself as a Christian apologist. And I recently listened to an interview you had with, and I thought it was a great interview. I learned some things about interviewing people, with Miles K. Donahue. And that was done on at least it looked like it was recorded on the 30th of September, 2025. And he says this in a little bit of his kind of intro to that. I think it's now on YouTube. He says, Randal, himself a Christian apologist, joins me to critically examine some of the mistakes and excesses of Christian apologetics, as it is commonly practiced on YouTube and within broader academic discourse as well. And you said in another written piece, and I'll stop here and let you make some comments, of course. You said this in your pursuit of truth. If Christianity is not true, I want to know. And I'm not sure that's a common confession of most Christian apologists. Am I correct on that?
Well, in one sense, I don't know. It's a statistical claim, and I don't have the demographic data. But I do think that, generally speaking, well, let me just give you, first of all, actually, Doug, it is good to be with you. And thanks for that intro. So I'm reminded of the Dallas Willard quote. He said, if Jesus were not the truth, he'd be the first person to tell you to look elsewhere. And I think that's a pretty great statement, because one of the things that says to me is it models for a Christian what we would call epistemic virtue, or virtue in how we form our beliefs, and a commitment both to want to know what the truth is and to be willing to confront the degree to which we may be wrong about the truth. Paul said, we see darkly as through a glass. He commended people as the Bereans in Acts 17 for being willing to question their current beliefs and evaluate new data that was very much contrary to those beliefs. And I think I bring all that together. I'm like, we got to all recognize that we're fallible, flawed human beings, that we shouldn't just be worried about perpetuating the party line, whatever that may be, whether it's in religion, politics, or philosophy, or anything else, right? We have to recognize the degree to which we could be wrong and always be willing to test ourselves and hold on to that which is true.
So I put together two questions, and you and I kind of did this together. And I'm going to start with the first one because I think it kind of fits with even what you just said. What is the most difficult objection to Christianity?
Yeah, probably. I mean, in one sense, it's the problem of evil, I think, clearly. Because sometimes I'll hear Christian apologists talk about the problem of evil as a simple thing. In fact, they'll try to turn the tables on skeptics of Christianity by saying, in fact, the real problem of evil is that you don't have good or evil without God. That life is just meaningless. And so that's an attempt to flip the tables, as it were. But first of all, I'd like to say, look, you can even set aside the whole question of good and evil. And instead of talking about the problem of evil, you can just reframe it as the problem of suffering. Why is there suffering in the world? And so much of it. I could imagine some degree of suffering in the world, and that there could be greater goods that could come out of it. It could be allowed for those greater goods. But the world seems to have an excess of suffering. It is distributed in such a way that it seems not to match on to, God punishing the righteous
Yes.
God rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked kind of thing. I mean, often it's the wicked that die happy and old in their beds, and the righteous that live short, painful lives. And there's so much suffering in the animal kingdom. There's so much suffering around us. And if you really focus on it, like child suffering with cancer, I mean, what do you do with that? What do you do with a child? Like my wife just showed me a video the other day. She's been following this family's journey. Their child has cancer. Well, they passed away finally at the age of 8. And just before this child finally passed, he was begging his dad to let him go. And the morphine could no longer hold off the pain. It was just so devastating to see this frail child with their face burned with the chemo that they'd been doing and their lips blistered, and they could not get relief. And the other kids, 8 years old, just have the most happy, carefree life. And you're thinking, it just doesn't make sense. So I would say the problem of suffering generally is one that every Christian has to grapple with. And just to cap that off, C.S. Lewis, he famously wrote a theodicy, or a work explaining why God allows suffering, which was called The Problem of Pain. And it is one of the leading theodicies or defenses of God with respect to evil, written in the 20th century. But when his own wife was diagnosed with cancer and he finally lost her, he wrote a very different book called The Grief Observed. And in that book, he talks about all the arguments that he had disappear when a jab of pain comes, like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. And that really captures for me the dilemma that you could even have the best intellectual explanation of evil, but when you actually are in the midst of deep suffering, those arguments can vanish like an ant in the mouth of a furnace.
So, how does that affect, what am I trying to ask here? First of all, I just appreciate you so quickly going to not just the topic of suffering, but a specific story, because I and so many people live with those stories. Either they're stories that we, of course, see like your wife saw, or we know a family down the road or somebody within. I mean, we've all got it. How do you reconcile that with staying on course with your faith in Jesus Christ and his presence in the world, Jesus as the Christ? How do you reconcile? How does Christ and God sit in relationship to what you and I see? Is God affected by this? Is our God affected by this? And does that change? Does the nature of God change in relationship to the suffering? Because we change, Lewis changed. Help me there, Randall, just with what you think and see.
Elie Wiesel was, of course, a Jewish man who lived in Europe in World War II, and he was sent off as a child to the concentration camps. And he survived and lost his family along the way. And in the 1950s, he wrote a Nobel Prize winning book called Night, which was a memoir of his experiences in the camps. And then actually 30 years ago this year, he wrote the first volume of his memoir called, I think, All the Rivers Run to the Sea. And in that book, as a Jew, he has a 3-page chapter called God's Suffering, a Commentary. which I thought was quite fascinating. So in that book, sorry, in that short commentary, he tells a story from the rabbinic tradition that says that the king sent his wife out into the out of the castle, and she had to fend for herself. And so she was struggling. And then finally, after several days, he brought her back to the castle. And she said, "Why did you send me out only to bring me back again? You know, send me into exile and then bring me back." And he says, "Know only this, that I could not live alone. So I followed you out and I was with you in the midst of your suffering there." And then Wiesel concludes and he says, "No, that's not an answer, but it's just another question." Now, there's a couple things about that. The first thing that strikes me about that is it's not like a precise philosophical explanation for evil. It doesn't tie it all up in a nice, tidy bow, which is very much the Jewish tradition that I think sometimes Christians miss out on. The very name Israel, which was, of course, given to Jacob because he wrestled with the angel through the night, captures the idea of what it is to be Israel, which is to be willing to wrestle with God and not settle for inadequate answers, but to keep striving and questioning. Because in that very process of striving and questioning and raising your concerns and being honest about your pain and your doubts, that, in fact, is the way to piety. And I think sometimes Christians, they think, well, if I just keep quiet and I'm not showing my doubt and my pain and my anger, somehow that's a more faithful, devout way to live. But it's not. I think that we have to be honest about our pain and our questions and realize there aren't simple answers. So that's the first thing I get from Wiesel. The second thing I get from him is it's frankly just his reflection is knocking on the door of a doctrine of incarnation. So the idea that God enters history in the midst of our suffering with us through his Son, and in his Son has experienced the kinds of suffering that we experience. So again, that's not a simple answer. In some ways, it is just another question, but there's also an existential identification that God has made with us in our suffering, which I find to be profound.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey of you always interacted with these questions that have led you to a heart, not just a mind, but a heart about the suffering? I can feel it in you. I mean, I can hear it and feel it in you. What's been the road to come to that? Because it would be very easy to say, well, let's look at your title. You're an apologist and you're an ex-seminary professor, and you would have all the answers. And if you give us the answers, they're intellectual type answers, but they don't make tell me a story that makes me hurt. And you told me a story that makes me hurt for this 8-year-old. How do you account for coming to that with the background you have? And you have a PhD from where? And is it King's College or somewhere? I mean, how do you account for coming to this, being a human with your faith? That's the way I often think of it, is I listen to so many Christians, and maybe at time I was one. It's kind of like, I sound like an anti-human person almost. How do you account for you coming to this in your own journey?
Well, yeah, so just as background, I did go to King's College, University of London, and did my PhD there back in 99 to 2002. But in terms of my wrestling with suffering and the problem of suffering, I have to be honest that I haven't experienced it myself, I would say, in a deep way. I mean, I've had loss. Like, my father died of dementia a few years ago and Alzheimer's, and we've lost a few dogs. And for people who are dog lovers, in fact, there's a dog sleeping at my feet right now. For people who are dog lovers, they can say, yeah, losing a dog is losing a family member. But when I see the kind of suffering around the world, I don't even want to mention the suffering I've experienced in the same breath.
I understand.
Yeah, because it's not there. I think I do. Of course, I have, I think, some degree of empathy, and I also I do think I have a ability to steel man, which I think is very important. So straw manning, we're probably more familiar with that term. That's when you treat objections to your belief systems. You either address the weaker versions, or you straw man an opposing person's views by presenting their argument in a weak form and treating that as a strong version. And I've talked about virtue, epistemic virtue before. Straw manning is not an epistemic virtue. So what I think a Christian should always do, and everybody should do, is to steel man. And that is to treat objections to your view and the views of other people in the strongest form possible. And once you steel man the problem of evil and suffering, I think you really are forced to grapple with it at an existential level. And part of steel manning is exactly what you referenced: thick narrative descriptions of actual cases of suffering, because it's so easy to talk about the problem in an abstract philosophical way that keeps it at arm's length, like you're in a philosophy seminar room.
Yeah.
That's kind of like Lewis's treatment in The Problem of Pain. And it's not a bad thing to do, just to recognize that's not yet in the deep end of the pool. And your arguments are only going to be as good as they can sustain you through the deep end of the pool or the dark night of the soul. And I do think that once you look at evil as a consuming existential problem and suffering as this consuming existential problem, it's very difficult to have any sort of triumphalist approach to it. And you really need to bring together sort of the apologetic and the theological straight along with the pastoral if you're going to adequately and responsibly deal with that problem.
Could you share with us some of the scholars, theologians, even just people in your community, people in your family, or an aunt or an uncle? Who's had the most impact on you? A few select people, either you met them or you didn't meet them, but you would say, these people have shaped me. Their writings, their conversations.
I would say probably one person that intellectually shaped me was a systematic theologian named Colin Gunton. And I actually went and studied with him in England in 1999. So he was a leading British theologian. He actually died tragically in 2003, just 3 months after my defense of my thesis. So that was a great loss. So he was somebody who impacted me because I think one thing, you referenced earlier that I'm an evangelical, broadly speaking, but within America today, and to a lesser extent within Canada, evangelicalism has frankly a lot of baggage and is often associated with a rather narrow sectarian and highly politicized vision. And that's very different from the more broad-minded ecumenical spirit that you will find in England and with people like Colin Gunton, who I studied with. So I really appreciated that from him, and I learned a lot from him. I could also actually talk about some of the negative ways I was shaped. And I don't want to dump on my upbringing by any means, because there's mostly my upbringing was very wonderful. But you kind of look back in retrospect, and like some of the pastors that I had and youth pastors that I had in my Pentecostal church growing up, they impacted me at a very formative period, but in a much more fundamentalist mindset. And a lot of that stuff I had to unlearn, including a dispensational theology and a fear of the imminent end of the world and a belief that the world was going to be just thrown into the trash can and God was going to whisk us off to heaven with the great dispensational judgment. Again, a highly politicized view of things and a very moralistic view of Christian faith, which I think is not a helpful and healthy view, including, I even remember back in the late 80s, I asked my youth pastor, we were doing air bands. And I asked him, well, could I do an air band of Larry Howard, who was a Christian blues singer? And he had an album called Sanctified Blues. So I wanted to do a Larry Howard air band. And my youth pastor said, Brother Randy, blues can't be Christian. And I said, oh. And just looking back on that, it's like, that's unbelievable, because the Bible is full of the blues, right? So you read, whether it's Ecclesiastes or the Psalms or Job, there's all sorts of people experiencing the blues, whether it's John in prison, right? John the Baptist in prison. People experience the blues. It's part of the Christian journey. And so just kind of looking back on some of the inadequacies and weaknesses of things I had to unlearn along the way.
Would you tell me about, because you mentioned it earlier when we were setting up our conversation, you're no longer a seminary professor. I think if I remember, you shifted like in 2023, and you referred to your day job. And I'll stop there and maybe talk about that in relationship to being an apologist and everything else that you are, because you're a very active human being. What's your day job, and how did that birth from being a seminary professor?
So I was a prof for 20 years. And back in 2004-05, I had a student who was a former police officer and detective, and we became friends. In fact, he was nationally known in Canada at the time, because he'd been a whistleblower with the RCMP. He'd been on Maclean's Magazine, which was like Time Magazine in Canada. He'd been interviewed by Fifth Estate, which is like 60 Minutes in Canada. So he's very well known. So we became friends, and he eventually started, with his background, he started a workplace So what we'd call it a human resources risk management firm, which includes workplace investigations. And so I started working with him doing that back in 2019 part-time. So what that means is like when you would have a complaint, let's say harassment or sexual harassment or bullying within organization, a company, school, a church, and if it's beyond human resources capacity or skill set to be able to handle that, or they want to outsource it to an external investigative company, they could go to Veritas Solutions that I work for. And so we would do those investigations. So I started doing that part-time in 2019, went into it full-time in 2023. And there's a lot of transferable skills, interestingly. And I've also got all my credentialing in that area. So I've probably done about 150 investigations or more at this point. So there's things like doing credibility assessments, knowing how to interview people, knowing how to get information from them in a collegial manner, which is what we call the peace interviewing method, and then evaluating all the evidence, making a balance of probabilities assessment as to what happened and whether it breached a code of conduct, a policy, or legislation, and writing a report about it. Those are all things well within my skill set. The only thing I had to get used to was that in the old days, I would write a book. I've written 18 books along the way. And you'd write a book or you'd write a journal article and then publish it and the world can read it. But when you're writing a report in an investigation, you don't give that to the world. You give that back to the client and then they go from there. So that's the one thing I had to get used to.
Do you, you refer to this as your day job, and I think many times when people do that, maybe not in your case, it's like they're doing it for an interim time or they're doing it for the finances or whatever, but there's no sense of real passion or calling. Does this feel like it's kind of mushroomed into this is kind of predominantly what you're doing in the world?
Well, that kind of abuts onto what a theology of calling is. So the way that I would understand...
Please talk about that.
Yeah. The way I would understand a theology of calling is that we all Christians have a primary call, which is to take up our cross daily and follow Christ. And that calling is lived out in innumerable callings throughout our lives. So for me, certainly one of my secondary callings at this point is to be a workplace investigator. And I think all of our callings, whether it's that or whether it's being a father or a husband or a YouTuber or, author, all of those should be subservient to and serving in some way that primary call to take up your cross and follow Christ. And I certainly think that the connection points are very obvious for what I do in the workplace and my primary calling, because I'm concerned with truth. I'm concerned with healthy, psychologically and socially safe environments. I'm concerned with preventing abuse and identifying abusers. You can just go on down the list. And I think the connection points between what I do as a workplace investigator and my primary calling is just all over the place.
Wow. Thank you for making that connection, Randal. So, this happens to me in interviewing. It's like, okay, I've got 15 questions jostling around in my brain. Let me see if I can sort one out, suss one out, and pull it out. I'll tell you the one that comes to mind. You and I had talked about this one earlier. It's the, sorry if I get this wrong. What would you tell your teenage self? Yeah, I remember us chatting about that. Take us on that journey.
Gosh, well, I'm hearing feedback. Okay, well, I'll just keep going. So it's what I would tell my teenage self is keep the main thing the main thing. Maybe start right there and then go on. What is the main thing? Well, the main thing I think in the Christian tradition is fairly well captured in the Apostles' Creed. And what you don't find in the Apostles' Creed are all of the things that were big hangups for me that I had to kind of work through in the years following that, such as creation, evolution, origins, science, young earth versus old earth, those kinds of things. Yeah. The Apostles' Creed doesn't take a stand on that. It doesn't take a stand on what is your theory of posthumous judgment? What kind of view of hell do you have? It doesn't take a view, it just talks about life everlasting, right? It doesn't take a view on, the millennium or the end of the world events. It doesn't take a view on which political party you vote for or whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. It doesn't take a view on how to think about all sorts of issues. It doesn't mean that those are not important issues to think about, but I think we have to be very careful about adding many of those things as definitional to what it is to be a Christian. Kind of start with a core confession, like God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, and go from there. And then you can begin to add things. But I think too often Christians have been known for majoring on the minors, and also for like majoring on social wedge issues that contrast them with the wider culture. And I think when you're always working on contrasting yourself with the wider culture, it ends up overplaying the contrasts and underplaying the continuities. So you've mentioned apologetics, and what I've, for example, done in one of my books, The Doubter's Creed, is say, I think a lot of apologists have focused on an apologetics of agitation, meaning that they try to show how contrary belief systems are inadequate, implausible, flawed, and false. And what that ends up doing, frankly, is alienating people. What Paul did, interestingly, in my view, in Acts 17, when he spoke to the people, the crowds at Mars Hill, and in particular the Stoics, he didn't seek to approach them through agitation, or at least not initially. He sought to build a bridge, or what I say an apologetic of agreement. He said, look, your own philosophers have said, in him we live and move and have our being. We are his offspring. So Paul starts off by quoting favorably from Stoic philosophers and saying, I approve of that. And I honestly think if Paul came and did this today, many evangelical apologists would call him a pluralist. Oh, you can't quote agreement with the Dalai Lama or with an atheistic naturalist or with a Muslim. You must be a pluralist or something. No, Paul would seek to find the continuities that he could, or what missiologists call a point of contact. And that's what I think is often missing today. And that's what I would say to my 18-year-old self is look for the continuities. So really two things here, keep the main thing, and then look for the continuities with others. There you go.
Thank you. In one of your interviews, it might have been the one with Miles Donahue, you talked about missional impulse. Those words come back to mind, and they just popped in my head. I can imagine that some would say, well, Paul was doing that as a setup with a missional impulse. He was trying to win souls. He was trying to defeat any kind of argument, which really doesn't allow for open discourse. And it clearly doesn't allow for Paul to learn anything. And it seems like the mentality is of many evangelicals, North American evangelicals, or however we put that, kind of this new kind of nationalism thing is, I have nothing to learn. I heard somebody recently, and how many times have I heard this? The only place I learn is from the Bible. This is the only place I learn from. So I have nothing to learn from anybody else. So I think you would say that that wasn't what Paul was doing. Paul wasn't somehow setting and manipulating this up with a missional impulse of, I'm going to win you over. And if not, I'll just discard you and move on. That's not in any way what you're saying. What do you do when, for example, when you spoke about the Apostles' Creed, I can imagine a biblical, and I'll put biblical critic going, well, Randall, all those things you said the Apostles' Creed doesn't speak to, the Bible does. The Bible speaks to every one of them. And then you'll get that, verse, boom, 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 all these verses. And by the way, I know that we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to get into the things you've been saying about the Old Testament genocide. I want to get into some of that. But what do you say to the critic who goes, yeah, the Apostle Creed, it's a summation, it's the Cliff Notes. That's great, but it's not the Bible. I go back to the Bible. Bible is my truth, and this is where I work from. And the world, I shut the world out. I don't want to listen to the world because the world has nothing to offer me because it's going to burn up anyways. And we'll be raptured out of this place. What do you do with that critic? And what do you do with the Bible? What do you do with the Bible?
Well, so there's at least a couple big picture things here. One is you reference this person having sort of dispensational theology where it just be whisked out of here and so on. One thing I might start off with that is by saying, well, it's interesting. Nobody believed what you just said in terms of dispensationalism until the mid-19th century when John Darby came along and started teaching that. And so
Wow.
It's what that gets us to is something pretty important, which is everybody comes to the Bible through a tradition. The Apostles' Creed provides a traditional interpretive framework for the Bible. We don't live, as I've said in one of my books, we don't live in the cabins that we built ourselves.
Yes.
We are born into a tradition, and that's how we are taught to read the Bible. And then, like I said, growing up, I had to unlearn certain things. Like, actually, it isn't unchristian to sing the blues. And to some degree, a person who learned to interpret the Bible through a dispensational lens may have to unlearn that. Well, the Apostles' Creed is, I think, it's not an infallible interpretive framework or lens through which we read the Bible. I'm not saying it's divine revelation. But I think you'd also be very unwise to think you can cast aside all interpretive frameworks and simply go to the Bible on its own, because we always interpret the Bible shaped by tradition, informed by tradition. That forms how we read the book itself. And I think often evangelicals have been lacking in their historical awareness and the degree to which they themselves, like everybody else, is shaped by a tradition when they read the Bible. So we need tradition, we need history, and there's other things we need as well in terms of forming our doctrine, like reason, like experience. Those also inform how we interpret the Bible and construct our doctrines.
So let's say tomorrow somebody knocks on your door and they're a safe person and they're holding a Bible, whatever age. Let's say they're at least, whatever age. And they say, hey, I heard that you ascribe to this book in some form. I saw you online or whatever, and I looked up your address, and hopefully you're not scared that I'm knocking on your door. And they're holding a Bible and they say, I've never read this book. I've never read it. I've heard a lot about it, but I've never read it. What is this book? I mean, what is this book? And they're asking from a very simple place, because it's a starting place. What is this book? And let's say you got a few minutes to be able to answer the question. How would you answer that person holding the book and honestly asking, what is this thing I'm holding? Is it just like all the other books in the library? Because I actually got it at the library. I don't even know if I should go out and buy it, because it sounds like it's kind of a bomb goes off with some people that read it. I don't know if I want to read it. What is this book? What would your answer be?
First, I must admit I would be creeped out if somebody came to my door. I would much prefer an email. But in terms of
let's
the
say you
itself,
felt safe once you stopped trying.
Yeah. So what I would say very simply and succinctly is this is God's story of his people, Israel, and the church, which testifies ultimately to his son, so that when we read it in accord with its purpose, we become more like his son. That's what I say. That's what it's about. It's to make us like Jesus.
And then if the person asks, because there's somebody who studied history, and they just go, the God you speak of, did he have a group of people prior to Israel? And did he work with in a different time period of the world? Because it's an old world. It's been around a long time. Did God just show up with a new group of people? What about all the people that presupposed Israel and whatever? What was God doing then? What would you say to that person from that real elementary question?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way the question is phrased would indicate an inadequacy. First of all, a misunderstanding, which itself would suggest an inadequacy in my explanation. There's a lack of clarity there. So to talk about God's story of his people, Israel, and the church is not an exclusive stance to say this is just the people God cares about and hangs out with. Rather, it's a concept of election, that God chose these people in history in some particular way to be heralds of his kingdom, to bring the world, as God says to Abraham, through you all nations on earth will be blessed. So this idea that we were chosen to bring the world to him and into conformity with his son. So he's everywhere, and he's working with all these people all the time, and he had a special electing relationship with his people, Israel, and the church.
Is the Bible infallible?
Well, it depends what you mean by that. But if you mean the Bible will not fail in the ends for which God purposed it when read in accord with its purpose, something like that, then sure, you could say it's infallible. I think part of the problem with terms like infallibility and inerrancy in particular is the way that they often get bandied about. It is a way, first of all, of shutting down people from questioning certain accepted theological interpretations. So if you question what the young earth creationist says about how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2, or if you question the one you referenced earlier in terms of genocide, if you question how to interpret Deuteronomy 20 or Joshua 6 when it talks about God commanding the eradication of the Canaanites, you are thereby questioning inerrancy, and you're not allowed to do that. In fact, what you may just be doing is questioning the interpretations of the passages as you've been given them. So we need to be careful about the way those concepts can be weaponized to quash questioning, which, as I said earlier, is a very important and healthy part or expression of Christian discipleship.
Let's talk for a few minutes about the church. What is church to you? I meet people, and I think I referenced this to you about my own journey prior to us jumping on here. But people that have been listening to this know that I've had a problematic relationship with the church and gathering and whatever. And I gathered in my home for a period of time, and I've done probably all the church models. I tried to become Catholic. That didn't work really well. I'm now back, and I'm going to church. What is the church? Is the church, that's number one. Is the church ceasing to be? One of my guests recently said, I think it's ceasing to be and it needs to cease to be. And then it will become some new iteration of it. It's like, well, what is the church? Because I can imagine my neighbors and people. I told one of my neighbors the other day, I was on my way to church. And I thought, there's a big word. I can only imagine what my neighbor is wondering about. Oh, so you're going to church. What is church? And is it ceasing to be?
So the church as a word is certainly polysemous, meaning it has many meanings. And so when you just described there, going to church, that's one meaning, which is like, in one sense, going to a local congregation down in the corner, but also is related to these other meanings. So some of the other meanings is in terms of the global church. Theologically, you could define it as the family of God, the body of Christ, the temple of the Holy Spirit, the bride of Christ. So those are theological metaphors to define church. You could define it demographically, sociologically, in terms of self-identification, people who identify as Christians. One thing I think we need to keep in mind in terms of the global picture of what the church is there's always tension between what we would call the visible church, which would be the kind of thing that might be studied by sociologists, let's say, or demographers, and the invisible church. And I think one of the best places to see the distinction is when Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. And interestingly there, he defines them with respect to how they treat the least of these in society. And the sheep are those who responded favorably to the least of these, and the goats are those who did not. And so if you talk about in and out, which is often how the language of church is thought, let's just say there's a pretty serious caution here for every Christian that we should be careful about thinking that visible global church maps neatly onto the invisible church. But rather, we should recognize both that there are many people who profess to be in the church visibly, who may say, but Lord, did we not do these things? And he will say, as much as you did not do it for the least of these, you did not do it for me. And then there will be others who don't think of themselves as being part of the visible church, which may be part of the invisible church because they have been loving their neighbor and living the way that Jesus describes in Matthew 25. So
Yes.
It's not a simple answer.
Yes. Yeah, it gets dangerous when everything tries to get, or we try, whoever, to simplify things. So let's talk for a few. First of all, I mentioned this when you and I were setting up, getting ready to hit the record button. You're catching some flack. You're controversial in some ways. To a group of people. I recently watched something. I didn't know the person. It was like Kirkwood something, some kind of ministry or something. This person spent about an hour just deconstructing everything that you say and believe and whatever. And then what are the critics so upset with you about? And I know that there's varied answers for that, and it's probably multiple. But what are people pissed off about with you?
Well, yeah, it depends on the critic, I'm sure. I would say, like, so the probably the couple things I'm most well known for in terms of irking critics. Well, first of all, so my book Jesus Loves Canaanites, where you've alluded to that with respect to biblical violence and genocide. So where I lay out the problem of biblical violence and the different alternatives to responding to it and offer very sharp critiques of some of the mainstream apologetic approaches to it. So that's one area where I would get some criticism. My most recent book, The Wideness of the Sea, How to Be Evangelical and Gay Affirming, is obviously going to be of offense to some people who that's certainly one of the most polarizing topics today, is to take an affirming stance on same-sex relationships, particularly because, again, for many evangelicals, they have defined Christian identity with respect to this question. And if you define Christian identity with respect to some question like that, well, then anybody who questions that is, from their lens, seen as questioning Christianity itself. Another area is I've been very strong on critiquing what I think is the cultural captivity of much of North American and particularly American evangelical identity to a far-right political agenda that I think often is defined by things including xenophobia and just plain nastiness.
We see it, right?
Yeah, I certainly think I do. So yeah, those are some of the areas where I've gotten my share of criticism.
Okay, and you'll probably get more.
That's okay. As you said, you referenced John Lewis at the beginning.
John Lewis, thank you.
Talking about good trouble. In fact, I once wrote a book called Is the Atheist My Neighbor?, critiquing Christian approaches to atheism. And when my editor read the manuscript, he wrote back to me and referred to me as a troublesome priest, which was, I think it was Henry II's famous phrasing of Thomas à Becket before he had him murdered. So Yeah, I like that. I
Just
like to be a troublesome priest.
were you as it back to this teenager? Were you making your own kind of trouble as a let's say 15-year-old, 16-year-old? Were you making trouble then?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I was the president of my school in high school in grade 12, our
Hmm.
final grade. And I mentioned to you earlier, we had a rock band. I like to go to parties and hang out. I was friends with everybody. I don't think, I mean, yeah, I would say this was interesting and sobering that probably 25 years after high school, somebody contacted me and said, "Do you remember me? Yeah, you bullied me." And honestly, I did not remember bullying that person. And so that was pretty sobering because although I knew that I could be a jerk at times, like I think a lot of obnoxious 17, 18-year olds, I didn't probably think of myself as a bully. And so to have that self recognition and then to make an apology to that person,
Hmm.
that was sort of sobering. And you know what? That is part of like a bigger journey of reflection because we all, not all, but
Hmm.
most of us, we tend to have some degree of an optimism bias where we view ourselves more favorably than the evidence wants or warrants.
Would
And yeah, so we need to be very careful about that. And so it's certainly an area that I've continued to reflect on.
Thank you, Randall. You were referring to the genocide piece. I'm looking at the clock. I want to be sensitive to that. So we know the Old Testament has rape, genocide, child, infant killing, Deuteronomy 20, 1 Samuel 15:3, Numbers 31, and other passages. So this is the way it's coming to me to ask you. And maybe this will take us all the way to the end. When you're doing these investigations in your new, I'll call new day job, you have to have a stamina. I'm assuming, correct me if I get any of this wrong, you have to have a stamina to investigate and keep going for the truth. And I'm sure it becomes uncomfortable. I'm sure it becomes uncomfortable for the person that you're asking, but the word stamina comes to my mind. You can't just fall apart as the investigator. You have to stay with, I need to get to the truth for the betterment of whomever. Have you approached the Old Testament with that same kind of stamina? Like, I'm going to put you, in one sense, you, Old Testament, I'm going to put you in you're going to have to defend yourself. I'm going to take issue with these stories of, I mean, awful stories. And I appreciate because you don't dance around for that. I mean, it's genocide. It is genocide. And let's assume that some of, or not, maybe all of these things happened. Everybody, you made the comment, and I went back and read the passage. I knew you were right, but it's like it left the cattle standing, I think, or left some kind of animal standing that time. Other times, it was total oblivion. So, have you approached the Old Testament from that place of, I'm going to put you on the witness stand, and you're going to have to somehow speak for yourself so I can trust that there's validity in this, that I'm even going to read it? And maybe the kid or person who knocks on your door that goes, "What's this book?" I mean, does somebody say, "Just read the New Testament, man"? I mean, don't touch the Old Testament. But no, read the whole book. So have you come at that? Have you come at the text that way?
So the idea of, I sometimes hear this as, putting God in the dock or putting the Bible in the dock. So questioning God, and then you can come to the proof texts like from Romans 9, who are you, O man, to question God, this kind of thing. And people can shut down that kind of questioning. Well, the first thing I would want to say is what we're actually talking about here is not putting the Bible in the dock or in the witness stand. Rather, what we're doing, really, I would say, is putting particular interpretations of the text in the dock or in the witness stand. Because really what you're asking is like, how should I interpret this? Is, let's say, the interpretation that God literally commanded X or Y or Z, is that a defensible interpretation for a Christian to make? What happens then when you frame it like that is you're not actually questioning whether the Bible is God's revealed word. You're questioning, how should we interpret God's revealed word? And is this interpretation that I was taught an adequate one to believe that God did in fact command and commend
Mm.
genocidal slaughter of civilian populations? And if you conclude that it's not, then you go back to the text and say, okay, then let's figure out how we should interpret and apply this and live it out in accord with our discipleship of Christ. So that you're never questioning the revelation itself, the Bible per se, you're questioning the interpretations that have been given to you of it. I mean, a very simple example of that is Psalm 137:9, where the psalmist says, "Blessed is he who takes their babies and dashes them against the rocks." So you take that verse and you say, you're not questioning the verse's presence within the Bible. What you're questioning is how to interpret this, because some Christians say what that
Mm.
means is that sometimes it's okay to curse your enemies and their babies. It seems to me that's an absurd take on that passage. So I would repudiate this idea that sometimes it is consistent with Christian discipleship to hate your enemies and curse them and want to kill their babies. I think rather we should look for another interpretation, like this is simply providing a record of pained human experience where this writer
Mm.
himself was facing exile by the Babylonians and then did what every person in their human nature wants to do to those who oppress them, which is hit them back twice as hard. But Jesus said, it has been said, hate your enemies. The psalmist, I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So there I can arrive at a different interpretation and application of the passage than the one given to me after I put that particular interpretation into the doc and questioned it. And that's the general
That's good.
approach I would.
So we're talking about the Bible. It seems to me, and this might be a very simplistic way to look at it, but it seems to me you've got this book that needs to be carefully interpreted really well and accurately. But it's a book that is just sitting on somebody's book stand or the person that I set up that knocks on your door. And let's say they don't have the exposure to talking to you, or they can't get to seminary. And the reality is, this isn't just abstract wondering. This is a book that, if it's not handled correctly, is a very dangerous book. And it's a sacred text, so it's dropped out there. And it seems to me like most people will not even have the opportunity to fine tune, and as Walter Brueggemann talks about, to understand their own zone of imagination. He spoke of 3 levels in one of my favorite books that a lot of people don't know of Walter's, and that is Texts Under Negotiation. And I love the way he talked about, we don't come to the text, and you've definitely been implying this, we don't come to the text neutrally, right? We come with a zone of imagination. He broke it down in 3 levels. You come with your biases. You come with your fears. And then the 3rd level was the deepest. And he clearly was, and I mean, Walter was a friend of mine, and I know this by talking to other people who knew him really, really well, is that, the Freudian concept of the way a human being functions. He clearly studied Freud, but that 3rd layer of zone of imagination is your deep hurts. So we come with those, and we take this book, and if a person doesn't have, it just seems to me like it's quite a dangerous experiment for this book to be written and thrown out into the general public. And somebody might say, well, yeah, Doug, but, and I go, yeah, but look what's come from it. I mean, look what's happening in my country, and you see it because you look, I don't mean down on it like North America or Canada looks down on it, but I can imagine you just looking and going, I see, some of the elements within your own country, but look at what's happening in this country. And as I referred to earlier, the person truncated the whole conversation with, I just go back to the Bible. I just go back to the Bible. And I understand the flawness of that, and that person probably was privy to, you don't have to be that innocent or unintelligent or naive, but it does seem like quite a dangerous experiment with a sacred text to be thrown out there and see what's been done in the name of the Bible, i.e. God. It's just the things my wife went through in fundamentalism, and she, as somebody in the last quarter of her life, still dealing with what got into her DNA. And she has to, I hope when she listens, she said, I'm going to listen to, because I told her I'd be talking with you and what we'd be talking about. She said, I'm going to listen to that one. Maybe she doesn't listen to all of them. She lives with me, so she probably hears enough nonsense coming from me. But this is like deep in her DNA that she has to be, I know she has to position herself well to be able to even start talking about the Bible, because it just brings up so much stuff so automatically. Tough experiment with a sacred text, huh? Of how it needs to be handled. It needs to be handled carefully. Is that an okay way to say it, or handled well?
I guess the first thing I would say is at the end of my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, there's a chapter, I think it's chapter 12, addresses the problem of authorial ambiguation. So the idea being the Bible does present a seeming moral problem, is that the divine author, insofar as this is a divine communication to bring us into right relationship with him and his people, his creation, there seems to be a degree of ambiguity in the communication which makes it ineffective for that purpose. So, for example, here's a very simple illustration. Let's say that there's a pandemic sweeping across the country, and the government has information for how to get an inoculation to protect you against the pandemic. They're going to be as clear as possible in issuing the medical advice as to how to get that inoculation so you can be protected and your loved ones can be protected. And the Bible's not that. It's not like a clear, unambiguous communication, because there's enough ambiguity in how the text has been communicated to us that allows for all sorts of interpretations that have perpetuated great harm. And how does the divine author explain this? How does he explain himself and his own intentions and purposes? And that's something I think we all have to wrestle with. So I talk about that in that chapter. The other thing that I would just want to note is, so sometimes when you are critiquing a particular interpretation, and people will come back to you and say, well, you're questioning tradition and that's dangerous, or you're questioning the established teaching of the church and that's dangerous. Like I just mentioned, I wrote this book on how to be evangelical and gay affirming. That's seen as dangerous because you're questioning 20 centuries of church teaching on a particular issue. The one point I certainly address that in that book, but the one thing I want people to appreciate is there is no risk-free position, because sometimes very long-held traditions can be wrong. Tradition is valuable, as I said earlier with the Apostles' Creed, but it's not infallible. So sometimes sticking with the tradition can lead you astray. So there are Christians that for centuries approved of slavery and believed that slavery was God's will. We look upon that now and we think they were wrong. And Christians who thought they could simply rely on that tradition and be safe, they're not. There is no risk-free tradition. So we've got a difficult text, as you said, that sometimes there's great harm that can come from different interpretations and applications of it. And we have to wrestle with that problem and appreciate there's no risk-free approach to that wrestling itself. The last thing I'll just say is this. St. Augustine gave us a great general hermeneutical principle. He said, always interpret the Bible so as to increase your love of God and love of neighbor. And recognize that the love of neighbor is not just people from your in-group. It's the people exactly that you are least inclined to want to love. If your love is increasing of God and those people through your reading of Scripture, that's a good sign that you're doing it right. If your love is decreasing or being frustrated by your framework, so it's harder to love God or your neighbor, that's a good sign that you're doing it wrong.
Randal, that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much for this. I've learned so much. I appreciate it. Your latest book is the one that you spoke about. Give us the title again of that one, of the 20-some-odd books you've written.
It's The Wideness of the Sea, How to Be Evangelical and Gay Affirming.
Okay. And are you working on, I assume because you're a true author, are you working on another book?
I am spent right now.
I don't know.
So I usually take like half a year off at least before I start writing something else.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Tell me, thank you for saying that. Thank you for devoting your time to this hour. Let's go out this way. The dog you said at your feet, tell us about your pup that's at your feet. Because I got two beloved dogs at home. Who's at
perfect.
your feet?
Yeah. So Timbit is at my feet. He's our Lhasa Apso, and he had a catastrophic back injury a couple years ago. So we had to pay more than I ever imagined you could pay for surgery. And even now he walks on eggshells. In fact, he had another injury on Friday, but he's now recovering again. So our last Lhasa Apso lived to be 19 and he was immortal. And I'm just trying to find, the thing is, dogs love you no matter what. And right. So one of the things is dogs are, I think, a glimpse of the kingdom. Is I wish I could love other people the way that my dog does.
Randal, thank you. Thank you so much. Bless you. I don't know what it means to say from one human to another or one Christian to another state, stay safe. I'm not sure what that means, but I mean it. Stay safe. And I hope we can talk again. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Hang with me here. Stop the record button, and then we'll watch it load up, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you again, Randal.
You bet.